My son called me from the driveway of my late father's hardware store and said, "I had it torn down this morning." The asbestos inspector said it was a liability. "You should be thanking me." I almost dropped my phone. Then I started laughing, slow at first, the kind that builds from somewhere deep in your chest. Because what my son didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the building he'd just demolished wasn't my father's store at all. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. My name is Roland Pruett, and at 62 years old, I thought I was past surprises. I thought I had seen enough of human nature, the good and the ugly both, that nothing could shock me anymore. I was wrong. My father built Pruett Hardware on the corner of Millbrook Avenue and 3rd Street in 1971. He poured 30 years of his life into that place, 6 days a week, hands always cracked from the cold, always smelling faintly of machine oil and sawdust. When he died in 2019, he left the building to me along with a small life insurance policy and the tools he'd used since before I was born. My mother had passed 4 years earlier. The store was all that remained of them in any physical sense, the place where I'd grown up stacking shelves on Saturday mornings, learning the names of every bolt and fitting before I could ride a bike. My son had a different view of the property. He had married Wells, or so he believed. His wife came from money. Her father owned 3 car dealerships in the suburbs north of Columbus. And from the first Thanksgiving she sat at my kitchen table, I could see she measured everything against a standard I would never meet. My son, who I had raised on a teacher's salary after his mother left us, had somewhere along the way absorbed her way of seeing the world. Things were either assets or liabilities. People were either useful or they weren't. Sentiment was a weakness. He started bringing it up about 8 months after the funeral. Just casually at first, the way you mentioned the weather. "Dad, have you thought about what you're going to do with the store?" I told him I was keeping it. I had a tenant, an older man named Weston Briggs, who ran a locksmith shop out of the front half of the space and paid me $1,100 a month, reliable as clockwork. The arrangement worked fine. My son didn't think so. Over the next 2 years, he cycled through every argument he could think of. The building was old, the neighborhood was changing, the roof needed work, property taxes were going up. What was I going to do? Manage a rental property in my 60s? Didn't I want to retire somewhere warm? Didn't I deserve better than an old hardware store on a corner that used to be nice? His wife was worse. She had a way of framing her opinions as facts, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything. At Christmas one year, she spread printouts across my dining room table, comparable commercial properties, lease rates, recent sales in the area. "The lot alone is worth something," she said, in the tone of someone explaining arithmetic to a slow child. "You're leaving money on the table every month you don't sell." I listened. I thanked them. I didn't sell. What they didn't understand, and what I never tried to explain, was that I wasn't keeping the store out of stubbornness. I was keeping it because 18 months earlier, while going through my father's old filing cabinet, the green metal one he'd had since the Eisenhower administration, I had found something that changed everything I thought I knew about that corner of Millbrook Avenue. My father had been approached twice about the property, once in 1998, once in 2003, both times by the same regional development company, Lakeshore Capital Group, inquiring about the land. He had turned them down both times, written his refusals in his careful block handwriting, and filed the correspondence neatly in a manila folder labeled offers, not interested. What he hadn't realized or hadn't thought to tell anyone was why they kept coming back. I hired a commercial real estate attorney named Vivek Anand 6 months after the funeral. I told him I just wanted to understand what I had. He spent 3 weeks reviewing county records, zoning maps, and recent development activity in the area. When he called me with his findings, I had to sit down. The city had approved a mixed-use transit corridor plan in 2018. The corner of Millbrook and 3rd was directly in the path of a planned light rail stop. My father's property, which my son's wife had valued at maybe $300,000, sat on land that commercial developers had been quietly buying up for 2 years. Comparable parcels had sold privately for between $800,000 and $1.2 million. One parcel slightly smaller than mine had gone for $940,000 to a regional grocery chain that wanted the foot traffic the transit stop would generate. I did not tell my son. I thought about it. I genuinely did. But something held me back, some instinct I couldn't name, and I sat on the information for months while my son continued his campaign to get me to sell. I watched how he talked about the property. I watched how his wife calculated. I watched how they discussed my father's memory as if it were a line item on a balance sheet. And I made a decision. I am not proud of every choice I made in the year that followed, but I am not ashamed of them either. I was protecting something real. I just needed to understand exactly how far my own son was willing to go. With Vivek's help, I quietly sold a strip of land from the rear of the property, an unused alley easement that the development company needed to complete an access route for $380,000. The sale was entirely legal, handled through a small LLC Vivek had established for exactly this purpose. The money went into an investment account my son knew nothing about. With the remaining front parcel, I did something that seemed impractical at first, but made sense the more I thought about it. I contracted a local commercial builder to construct a facade structure on the property. Essentially a shell building, same footprint as the original store, same brick color, same painted signage on the front window. From Millbrook Avenue, it looked identical to what had been there for 50 years. The real building, the actual hardware store with my father's workbench still bolted to the floor and his tool pegboard still on the back wall. I had it carefully disassembled and moved into a climate-controlled warehouse unit 20 minutes outside of town. Every piece of that interior that could be saved was saved. Weston Briggs, my tenant, I moved into a newer commercial space 3 blocks away. I covered his first 6 months of rent and made sure he didn't lose a single customer in the transition. He thought I was doing minor structural repairs. My son never asked any questions about any of it. He drove past the store occasionally. He saw the same brick building, same faded Pruitt hardware lettering, and stopped worrying about it the way people stop worrying about things that aren't changing. His wife stopped bringing the property up at dinners. I thought maybe they had moved on. Then I went to Portland for a week to see an old college friend, and on the 3rd day my son called. I was sitting in my friend's kitchen drinking coffee, watching rain streak the window, when my phone buzzed. I picked up and his voice was different, tight, carefully controlled, the way it gets when he's been drinking and is trying to sound sober. "Dad, I need you to listen and not get upset." I waited. I had the building on Millbrook taken care of. The asbestos inspector came last month and the report was pretty alarming. I talked to a demolition company and they said they could clear the lot by Thursday. "I know you didn't want to sell, but this is a health and safety issue. Once this lot is cleared, you can list it and at least get something for the land." I sat very still. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but it needed to happen. The building was a liability and I was trying to protect you." That's when I started laughing. It came out of me before I could stop it, a long exhale of genuine amusement that I could hear confused him completely. Dad, this isn't funny. The building is gone." "I know," I said. "I heard you. Then why are you laughing?" "Because," I said, "that building wasn't what you thought it was." The silence on his end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. I flew home 2 days early. My daughter-in-law had prepared for my arrival. When I pulled into my son's driveway that evening, the house was lit up, their good dishes visible through the dining room window. She came to the door in a blazer, which told me everything. She had dressed for a negotiation. My son looked like a man who had not slept well. There were photographs on the kitchen table when I walked in, printouts from the demolition company documenting their work. The shell building was gone, the lot cleared to bare concrete. I looked at the photos for a long moment. "I want you to tell me exactly what you did," I said. "All of it," my son explained. He had hired the demolition company under the claim that he was acting with my authorization as a family member managing a property concern. He had told them it was an asbestos emergency, which expedited the permits. He had made these arrangements over 2 weeks, while I was still in town, and then waited until I was in Portland to execute. "The asbestos report," I said. "Let me see it." He slid a paper across the table. I looked at it. The report was real enough, commissioned from a legitimate inspector, though the findings were, as Vivek would later confirm, well within normal ranges for a building of that era and nowhere near the threshold that would require demolition. "You paid someone to demolish a building on property you don't own," I said, "based on an inspection report that didn't actually require demolition, while telling the contractor you had authority you didn't have." My daughter-in-law spoke up. "We're family and that building was a drain. We were trying to help you move forward by destroying my property without my permission. It was becoming worthless. Every year you waited. It wasn't becoming worthless," I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder Vivek had prepared for this exact conversation. I set it on the table next to their photographs. The first document was the county zoning records showing the transit corridor plan. The second was the sale records for comparable parcels on Millbrook Avenue over the past 3 years. The third was the closing statement from my LLC's sale of the alley easement, $380,000, finalized 8 months ago. The fourth was the current independent appraisal of the remaining front parcel, $910,000. My daughter-in-law went still in a way I had never seen her go still before. "That building you demolished," I said, "was a shell. A facade. I had it built 18 months ago when I realized what the property was actually worth and started to understand what direction this family was moving in." My son looked at the documents, then at me. "You built a fake building. I built a replica exterior while I had the real structure moved into storage. Your grandfather's workbench is in a warehouse in Marysville. His tool wall is wrapped in moving blankets in the same unit. The building you demolished was a construction shell that cost me $60,000 to build and exists now as rubble in a dumpster. The real property," my son started, "is worth just over $900,000 and sits in my name alone, which it always has." What happened next is the part I had not entirely planned for. I had expected anger, maybe tears, the kind of emotional argument that ends with slammed doors and weeks of silence. Instead, my daughter-in-law went cold. "You set us up," she said. "I protected myself. You manipulated your own son into thinking he was helping you." I looked at her. I thought about the Christmas with the printed comparable sales. I thought about the Thanksgiving 5 years ago when she had asked me, smiling pleasantly, whether I had a will in place and whether my son was named as primary beneficiary. I thought about the way she had, over 6 years, methodically turned my son's understanding of his childhood and his grandparents and his own father into something smaller and more transactional than it had ever been. I didn't manipulate anyone, I said. I just didn't correct a set of assumptions that you two made and then acted on without my consent. You could have told us the property was valuable. You could have asked me before demolishing it. She stood up from the table and walked out of the room. My son sat across from me, looking at the documents, his face doing something complicated. Dad, he said finally. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about how to answer that for a moment. There were honest answers, and there were kind answers, and I wasn't sure they were the same. Because I needed to see what you would do when you thought I wasn't watching, I said, and now I know. I called Vivek from the car that night. He already had the file ready. The demolition company, as it turned out, had significant exposure. They had executed a demolition without verifiable owner authorization, which created both civil and criminal questions. My son's wife had signed an authorization document representing herself as having power of attorney on my behalf, which she absolutely did not have. That document created a problem for her that went considerably beyond a family disagreement. I did not want to put my son in legal jeopardy. That took some work on Vivek's part, threading the needle between my son's involvement and his wife's. But the evidence was clear enough that she had been the primary actor, and he had been in her hands a useful instrument. It was not a flattering portrait of either of them. The investigation took about 6 weeks. During that time, my daughter-in-law hired an attorney of her own and attempted 3 separate legal theories to either claim entitlement to the property or shift liability for the unauthorized demolition. None of them went anywhere. The property was mine, inherited cleanly, never commingled with marital assets, and her own documentation, the authorization she had signed, the communications with the demolition company, made it very difficult for her to claim anything other than exactly what had happened. My son stopped returning her calls somewhere in week 4. He showed up at my house on a Sunday morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Maple Street, where we used to go when he was in high school, and he sat in my kitchen for 3 hours. He didn't make excuses, which I respected. He asked questions and he listened to the answers, which he hadn't done in years. By the time he left, we hadn't fixed anything, but we had at least stopped pretending the break wasn't there. The divorce proceedings started the following month. I won't say I had no feelings about that. Whatever she was, she had been part of my son's life for 6 years, and watching a marriage end is painful regardless of circumstances. But I also watched my son, in the weeks that followed, slowly become someone I recognized again. He called more often. He talked about his grandfather without the flat, dismissive tone that had crept into his voice somewhere during those 6 years. He came over on a Saturday in October and helped me unload the first boxes from the storage unit, his grandfather's tools wrapped carefully in old moving blankets, and we spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing them without saying much. The property on Millbrook Avenue sold in March for $925,000. The buyer was a commercial development group that intended to build mixed retail at street level with apartments above. The light rail stop was still 2 years from completion, but the area was already changing, coffee shops and small restaurants filling in where vacant storefronts had been. I put $400,000 into an investment account I set up for my son. Not as a gift, I told him, but as what his grandfather would have called a foundation. The kind of money you don't touch except for something that actually matters. A house, a child's education, a real emergency. He didn't argue with me about it, which was new. I kept enough to do what I had been thinking about for 2 years. The town I grew up in has a vocational high school that my father always talked about, the place where he had learned woodworking and shop skills before he could afford college. The program had been cut in the 2010s for budget reasons, which my father, in his last years, mentioned with a particular kind of sadness. I made a donation large enough to reinstate the program for 10 years, and I asked them to name the workshop after my parents. They agreed. The dedication was on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The principal spoke, a few students spoke, and I stood in the back of the room, trying to hold it together, which I mostly did. My son was standing next to me. At some point during the remarks, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder the way men in our family do when they don't have words for what they mean. I didn't say anything, neither did he. After the ceremony, we drove to the storage unit together and spent the rest of the afternoon moving the last of my father's things. The workbench, finally, which took the 2 of us and a furniture dolly and more effort than either of us wanted to admit. We drove it to the vocational school and installed it in the new workshop. The shop teacher, a young woman named Beckett Walsh, who had learned her trade from her own grandfather, ran her hand along the edge of the bench and said it was the finest piece she'd seen. I thought about my father, who would have liked that very much. Weeks later, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and the kind of quiet that only feels peaceful when you've earned it, I got a text from my son. No message, just a photograph. He was standing in front of a small house, A real house, his first, in a neighborhood that looked like the kind of place where kids ride bikes in the street and neighbors know each other's names. He had put down a deposit. He was starting over. I looked at that photograph for a long time. My father used to say that the most valuable thing a man can leave behind isn't money or property or anything you can put in a box. It's the example of how he lived. I used to think that was something you said because you didn't have much else to leave. Now I understand he meant something different. He meant that eventually, if you're lucky, the people you love stop imitating the wrong things and start imitating the right ones. I'm still waiting on some of that. But I'm patient. I've got time.